Thanks, folks, for joining in and joining with the growing crowd of people who are tuning into Stockwell Day to Day News. We appreciate that very much in Canada and the US, picking up people who are following us, and keep those comments coming because it's very helpful for me to determine what kind of things we're delivering and if it's meeting the listeners and the viewers' needs. In Canada and the US right now, there's a dramatic play being played out in the respective legislatures of those two countries, in the House of Commons in Canada and in Congress in the US. And it's almost like the two sides are comparing notes, though I know I can tell you from my own experience in the House of Commons it's not being done deliberately. But in Canada right now, we are days away from the budget, which is an annual event, the budget being tabled, and that has to get majority support in the House of Commons. Otherwise, the government will fail and an election will be called. In the US, there's something that is going on, as our US watchers know, and maybe our Canadian viewers should be aware of. And that's the government, so-called government shutdown, where they have legislation that if certain things are not met budget-wise, and it's something called the continuing resolution. So unless they pass something called the continuing resolutions, government dollars literally will not continue to flow. Government shuts down. And in both those cases, in those situations, it is the people on the left side of the political spectrum. So in Canada, that's called the New Democrat Party. And of course, in the US, that's the Democrats themselves. And they're both saying the same thing. They're both saying if there's any cuts at all, any reductions at all, any efficiencies at all, they're not going to vote for the budget, which is an amazing thing because all economists, even those on the left side of the spectrum in Canada and the US, are saying very clearly that you just can't keep borrowing money. Governments just can't keep increasing their debt because that increases the deficits, it increases the debt, it increases the amount that government has to borrow, and eventually the economies of those countries become so fragile that the large bond companies, bond releasing institution banks and others just won't release the money to be borrowed, and you literally come to a financial cliff. Now, on both sides again, it seems that the people on the left leaning towards socialism just completely are unaware or just not willing to accept that you can actually borrow so much money you can't pay it back, and then you have a government or an economic collapse. It's a lack of understanding, and it's really built on John Maynard Keynes made a very famous reply one time when he was delivering his economic message to a university crowd, and it was basically along these lines that, if you run into trouble, just keep borrowing. And when a student asked him, they said, well, Mr. Keynes, in the long run, won't everything just collapse? And he said, well, in the long run, we'll all be dead. And that's very much the approach that seems to be taken by the NDP and the left-leaning Liberals in Canada and the Democrats in the United States. And I say to that, yeah, in the long run, I'll be dead, but my grandkids won't, and my kids won't, and I'm going to be stifling them and overloading them with debt that's just going to be crushing them. So it's time that parliamentarians or people who get elected to office basically looked at some realities of life, and that is that budgets can run out, and there are times when you have to look at where do you have to hold the line on spending. When you look at Canada's approach, shifting it to a little different approach here, there's in the tariff war, and I've said before, I don't generally agree with tariff, and tariff economics usually do not work. Having said that, it's now being observed that no country in the world right now is losing more in the tariff wars than Canada is to the US, which is ironic since we historically could be, have been, and should be best neighbors, both of us across the fence, albeit we're always going to have some pretty strong disagreements. And the other observation that's been made as far as how Canada is handling the disputes with the US, no other country is on record where its politicians, either present politicians or former politicians, so openly and deliberately insult the personality of the President of the United States in terms of personal slurs rather than sticking to the agenda and duking it out, fighting it out in terms of rules and regulations. And we should be aware, any negotiator worth their salt should be aware that when you look at the person that you're negotiating with on the other side of the table, in this case it's Donald Trump, you try and get around the idea of how does he think, and all his thoughts have been put out very clearly when it comes to negotiating in his book called The Art of the Deal. And in The Art of the Deal, he's very clearly saying, don't personally attack the person that you're negotiating with. For sure, duke it out in terms of having good, robust debate, but do not personally attack. That could cause the person not to be thinking clearly. And then the other thing that Trump says in The Art of the Deal, for those of you who are advising the people that are supposed to be helping Canada understand how to deal with Trump, the other thing he said was, however, if the person on the other side attacks you personally and stoops to personal insults and name calling, then you hit back, and you hit back harder than you were hit. So I'm wishing that Canadian politicians, present and former, past ones, would realize that strategy of personal insult just doesn't work. Get down to saying and asking ourselves, what is the other side looking for? And can we deliver some of what the other side wants? Maybe there's areas in which we disagree. We consistently know that security, border security, is huge for the U.S. That's something we've got to be seen as being vigorous. We know that continental security, prevention from possible nuclear attack, whether it's North Korea, China, or Russia, that it will probably come from the northern border across the Arctic. Therefore, looking at constructing a dome of protection, the same type of dome that was has been successfully constructed over Israel with all the countries surrounding it. If it wasn't for the dome where they could knock down incoming missiles, Israel would be destroyed by now. Canada should be sending signals to the U.S. Yes, let's take a look at this. Let's see if we can come up with true defensive strategy that actually works. And people are saying, well, are Canadian negotiators just dumb? Why are they taking all the wrong approaches in terms of negotiating with Trump? There's a theory that's floating around out there that is being done on purpose, that there has always been a contingent within Canada whose hatred for the U.S. is so strong that they would rather see Canada actually do poorly economically and not have the great advantage of trade with the U.S., have less advantage by connecting with countries like China. And at the end, it makes us all poorer, but at least we're not reliant on the U.S. So we're poor, we can't buy as much, but at least we're not, looking to the U.S. for trade. I hope that theory is not true. I hope there aren't people who deliberately, just because they hate the U.S., are cutting off our noses to spite our faces, as we say. Let's see what rolls out as time rolls on. In the World Series, there we go. It was an exciting series. I think we should all tip our hats to players on both sides. It was great watching. The thing that I found interesting on the Canadian side is how intensely nationalistic the whole event became. It was as if the pride and the future of Canada itself was relying on the Toronto Blue Jays winning. And the amount of hysteria, and look, I'm a big fan, I believe in cheering and getting excited, but the amount of hysteria was so nationalistic and being promoted in media as such, it kind of made me wonder, because media is usually very against a sense of nationalism. They're always dumping on, someone who calls themselves a Canadian nationalist. But here was the media fanning the flames of nationalism, and ironically, doing it with a team, the Blue Jays. And look, I love those players. They're great. I like watching athletes. But we were basically cheering on a group of super athletic U.S. American multimillionaires. There were some exceptions there, but the vast majority. So here we had Canadians cheering on our own U.S. multimillionaires. people who will, and I respect them, they will leave Toronto as soon as they're offered something higher somewhere else. It's not like they are sold to Canada, but it just becomes a little bit irrational. Maybe we could just enjoy the game and hope we have another shot at it next year, and say a big congrats to players on both sides who did so well. One thing that is not going that well in Canada, at least in the minds of many people, are recent Supreme Court rulings. Now, there's always been, and there should be, a tension. There's some tension between the courts and the legislative or the elected side. That's one of the balances that make democracies work. There has to be some tensions there, one keeping the other in check. But the courts are supposed to be historically tied into what the intent of the legislation is, unless it's obviously a clear violation of human rights, like on racial grounds or something like that. And what we've had continually in Canada is rulings from the Supreme Court that don't seem to coincide with the wish of the people and the majority in Parliament. And we use the case in point. There's something in Canada called mandatory minimum laws. Those are laws which were brought into place really because of courts consistently ignoring the penalties that the legislature was deriving and coming up with on serious, repeat, violent offenders. And I emphasize that all the time: serious, repeat, violent offenders. And the stats are very clear. If you want to talk even things like break and entry or carjacking, assault and robbery, those are committed in any community by a fairly small percentage of people who continue to repeat, reoffend, and they go through the turnstile of not being put in jail. And so what is sometimes called a bleeding heart approach, judges will say, well, it's not fair to put people in jail for long periods of time. Yes, it is fair if those people are the serious repeat offenders, the small percentage that commit the largest part of the crime. And that's what legislatures try and get to impress judges on when they come up with these type of mandatory minimums. The most recent one that has shocked Canadians is the Supreme Court has just ruled in Canada regarding serious accumulators of child porn. And there's a case of two serious, not just accumulators, but those who are even alleged in the involvement of getting children into child porn and the creation of it. And there was a very minimum penalty put on child porn accumulators and producers of 1 year that was put in place some years ago. Just 1 year. That's very, very minimal. And the courts have even struck down that. They've said, oh, that's too cruel to a child porn. And remember, these are the very serious. This isn't somebody who, not that it would be excused, but who strays into something automatically. These are serious pursuers, creators, and groomers of child pornography. And the courts in Canada have said 1 year is way too severe for those folks. Quite rightly, Canadians are shocked across the country. The legislature, the House of Commons, is going to go back to the table. It's the only thing they can do, and try and toughen up the prevention to that would allow judges to continue to, in this case, it's with child porn accumulators, to let these people go free even after less than a year. People will say, well, how else can we, what do we do? Because you can't supposedly tell judges what to do. Well, you certainly can talk about it publicly. The other thing you can do is realize that since Justin Trudeau, since the Liberals were elected in 2015, they have appointed across the country over 600 judges at all different levels, at the provincial and the federal level. 600 judges appointed by Liberals who will all have a culturally Marxist view, will all be lenient on serious, repeat, violent offenders. So really, folks, at the risk of sounding political, keep voting Liberal and you will keep getting Liberal judges. That's just the way it works. You might want to think about that when you're going to the polls. On the business side, as we're looking at a new month of November here, we see business continuing to depart from Canada, and it's largely a result of the excessive regulatory regime which over the last 10 years or so has accumulated regulations at every level, municipal, provincial, and federal, and have accumulated to such a point where projects will take years and years just to get approvals, and maybe at the end of the line not get approved after decades and after billions of dollars. And so business will flee in those conditions, and it's fleeing to the US. So the irony is we're in this tariff war with the US, and yet we have business and investment going to the US. Now, I think what we're going to see is an ongoing accumulation of positive, efficient productivity in the US, because in the EU, in the European market, which has always been criticized for excessive regulation, guess what? They've just come up with a new regulation. They've just finished and completed this in the last week, and it's called, brace yourself for it, it's called the Corporate Strategy of Due Diligence Directive. It's even hard to say. The Corporate Strategy on Due Diligence Directive. And that's an increasing layer of regulation on every business to make sure that they've steeped up their human rights regulatory regime, and we all support human rights, but it's just getting way out of hand. They've really cranked up on the environmental side. It's gone completely out of control. So again, projects in the EU, and they desperately need them, especially energy-related projects, to get off of their dependence from the United States, and it's right out of control with this new directive. So guess what, folks? You're going to see even more business flowing to the U.S. In the U.S., they've come up with more common sense approach, for instance, on the nuclear industry, and the world is now accepting the fact that nuclear can be proven, even over the last 50 years, 75 years even, to be the safest form of, one of the safest forms, if not the safest form of energy creation. And with micro nuclear reactors, these are much small nuclear reactors that would just give energy to small areas. For instance, the Pentagon has just said they want a nuclear reactor giving all the power that's needed to one of their largest army bases, and they want that by 2028. So you're going to see the U.S. becoming increasingly efficient on energy, increasingly efficient in terms of regulations. And for all those people out there, especially this would be left-leaning liberals and socialists who are creating more regulations in their own countries, and they're actually only helping the U.S. to improve. You've heard the phrase, and it's one country, being the U.S., actually went to war on it, called representation, or taxation without representation is a famous phrase. Taxation without representation. That means you can't increasingly be taxed by people who aren't elected to be there. Well, now what we're seeing is regulation without representation. Regulation without representation means our elected people, whether it's municipal councillors, whether it's people at the state and provincial level or at the federal level, you've got to, I'm speaking to the men and women who get elected, you've got to become more awake, you've got to say and push back on regulations, you've got to demand of the regulators that they show the reasons why the regulations are coming into place. They got to show who's going to die if you don't put them in. You've got to show the cost of those. You've got to talk to the people who are affected by a regulation. You've got to be, as elected people, you can't just sit there and nod yes because you think it'll get you a smile from the media and a smile from the administration. You've got to start thinking of the cost of these and push back and find out which regulations make sense and which don't. So let's keep an eye on that. On the very interesting thing happening on our culture situation. So TikTok, which is, of course, we're still seeing what its future is going to be in terms of who's going to control it. They've just come up with a new awards system, a whole new awards ceremony, and it's called the U.S. Creators Award. And this is for people, for creators who are creating on the TikTok platform. As some other platforms are falling out of favor, like Netflix and others, TikTok is granting awards. And what it is, you'll know on TikTok, those of you who use it, it's all short form. In other words, messages and everything that's developed is much shorter form than longer term. And these awards are going under the Reel Shorts. It's called Reel Shorts. So short, think of that, and reels, think of movie reels. That's where the money is. That's where the emphasis is. Just to give you an idea, so a winner and a leader in this regard, I don't know if you've heard of Luke Dodge, but you're going to be hearing of Luke. And he just got an award for just one of his short form creations. It's actually a full on, like it's a movie, but it's very short. Episodes are 1 to 2 minutes long. So if you're getting tired of watching those movies that are, one episode a week and each one is an hour long, the new form, folks, just get with it. Reels short or short reels. Episodes are 1 to 2 minutes long. And on his recent production, which is called Don't Miss Me When I'm Gone. That's a good politician song. Don't Miss Me When I'm Gone. 100 million views. 100 million views. There isn't a movie company in the world that wouldn't drool over that, and they're drooling now. That's the way it's going, folks, whether we like it or not. The longer films just aren't getting the crowds these short ones are, so keep an eye on that. Another phenomenon that's happening in culture right now is the phenomenal rise of Christian music, the Christian music scene. Over the last 5 years, streaming on for and demanding Christian music has gone up over 60%. That's just gigantic. It's a phenomenal increase. And it's mainly the majority, not totally, the majority is Gen Z. And the other thing that they're noticing is the 75% of the streaming is done on repeat. And that means, for those of you who aren't using that form of entertainment, repeat means people are putting the song on to repeat a number of times until they tell it to stop, which shows there's a strong emotional attachment. It's like you hear a song, you want to hear it again, and you want to hear it right away again. So it's not only the increase among Gen Z, but the amount that's coming on repeat is very significant. I guess it reflects, there is a scripture that talks about creating melody in our hearts. So the form of the actual music is seeming to take, getting a wider audience. The form meaning not the pounding, unsyncopated or overly syncopated, disjointed sound of music that some forms of music take, but it's melody and it's harmony, and it's the type of music that reduces anxiety. All seems to be catching on strong in the market. We'll think about that. Have a wonderful, melodious day, folks. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.